Well, hello again. Uh, this past quarter of the school year, when all of the teachers and students were throughout America were at home, um, I was doing my teaching, via video, and some of my students would notice that I'd put out two uh, 2 days videos, but I was wearing the same shirt, um, which means that I'd made them both on the same day. So I'll admit this is video 2, um, and yes, I'm wearing the same shirt. So if I make any more videos, it'll be tomorrow at the soonest, and by then I will have changed. So we're still in Genesis chapter 1, and I kind of stopped for I'd already gone 45 minutes on that video, so I wanted to kind of stop there. But today we're going to start with day 3 of creation. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. Okay, I wanted to start with a discussion. This little phrase, God creating things that would reproduce according to their kind. In other words, cows make cows, goats make goats, apple trees make apple trees, etc., according to its kind. And it's interesting because, again, not to keep beating on the same dead horse, but the theory of Darwinian evolution depends on the idea that a thing can morph into something that's not its kind, and that these changes, it depends on which evolutionist you talk to. Either these changes happened very gradually over a long time, or a species was exactly the same and then it would change very rapidly into something else. So evolutionists disagree over that. But in either case, you would have a thing turning into something else. Okay. Now that clearly violates the rule of something reproducing according to its kind. So even here, without using the word evolution, Genesis chapter 1 is speaking against evolution. So that's a very important thing. Now we know that scientists are currently trying to get around this rule by forcing changes in different species. And this is still an area of science that's kind of in its, maybe not infancy, but they're trying to turn animals into something else, or to make them more than what they normally are. Okay, so if you read any science news, you know that scientists are trying to create what are called chimera animals, chimera embryos. In Greek mythology, a chimera was a creature that had a lion's head, a goat's body, and a dragon's tail, and then it spat flames from its mouth. Okay, so obviously nothing like that has ever really existed. So the term chimera, it doesn't mean that scientists are necessarily trying to create monsters in a petri dish or something, but they are tinkering with living things. They really are. And so I have news stories that I've sort of printed off of the internet over the years. I first taught something along these lines back in 2005, and I noticed that periodically every year or so, some science journal or mainstream newspaper online will produce a story showing that the technology has gotten more complicated, and then they kind of give you an update. So currently, they can actually inject, say, take a pig embryo, and they can inject human cells into that embryo, and legally they can allow the embryo to grow to a certain number of cell divisions, and then legally they're supposed to stop it from growing anymore, because I do think that they're scared of seeing how far it will go, and everybody's kind of scared of that. So nobody has produced literally yet an an actual like pig boy. Okay, nobody's done that yet that we know of. And I always ask my classes, what's the motivation here? Why do people want to try to make a hybrid between a pig and a human? And usually my students, they'll just go, oh, so that they could put it at the fair and you could throw stuff at it, you know? Like, well, they're spending billions of dollars here. I'm not sure that would justify all that time and money just so you could throw dirt clods at it or something at the fair. There's more to it, and here's really the reason. They're trying to find a way to make replacement parts for human beings. You know, as it currently stands, if you needed a liver transplant, for instance, you get on a list, and if somebody is an organ donor and they die, they harvest the liver from that person, and then that liver goes to the next one on the list. Okay, now since people only produce one liver, they're hard to come by. You have to wait for somebody to die, right? So it turns out that pigs, in some of their internal organs, and from what I understand, even their eyes, for instance, are pretty close to that of human. And if scientists could figure out a way to make an actual pig that's identifiable as a pig, if they could make that produce a human liver by injecting cells into the embryo at a certain point in its development, they could then perhaps let the pig grow, excuse me, and then harvest that liver and give it to a human. And in harvesting the liver, they would only be killing a pig. See? This stuff gets very complicated because people are rightly concerned. What happens if some of the human cells don't hit the target? In other words, what if they don't necessarily go to improving we're changing the liver inside the pig, but the cells instead settle in the brain. And let's say that you've got a pig that is now self-aware. Okay, that all of that stuff right now is speculation. We haven't seen a literal pig boy yet. And in the Western world, where there are medical ethics, in England and in the United States and Canada, there are rules governing all this stuff, and they can only go so far with it. However, it's not hard to imagine some secret lab in North Korea somewhere where they're trying to do this kind of stuff. I don't know. The possibilities are endless. What if you could sell pork in the market that had a certain percentage of human DNA, and yet because the percentage is low, the people who sell the pork don't have to tell you about the human DNA in there, but they have found that the pork becomes even tastier. I mean, I don't know. That's speculation. I'm not a scientist, but that kind of thing, it makes people concerned. And what if they took and flipped it around? What if you have a human embryo that's developing, and just in the mad scientist sense, people start injecting animal DNA for purposes of making this human, faster, or to have better eyesight, or to just be physically tougher. See, all of these questions, so many questions. And we don't know where that's going yet. We're still kind of in the middle of it. Will I be surprised if 10 years from now somebody produces evidence of a 6 or 7 year old literal pig boy? Nothing surprises me anymore. But that's kind of where we're headed, I think. And it's impossible to know right now how far God's going to let that go. I don't know. It is something to be concerned about. All right, now day 4 of creation. This is the creation of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And it's interesting. This was pointed out to me in an Old Testament class that I took years ago when I was in seminary. And if you read it, it just says God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and he made the stars. It doesn't even name them, doesn't even use the word sun or moon. It just says greater light and lesser light. And most people, Old Testament scholars have speculated that, Moses here to combat the common paganism of Mesopotamia, the sun and the moon aren't even named. They're just called greater light, lesser light. God made them. He puts them to govern the night, or the day and the night, and for times and for seasons. That's it. That's what they are there for. When you look at the rest of the Old Testament, and when you look at ancient Near Eastern paganism, you find that all of the kingdoms of Mesopotamia, of Egypt, they all worshipped the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay? They thought that the planets and the stars were alive, and that the planet or star either was a god or had a god or goddess living inside of it. And in the Old Testament, we see that the main false religion that the Hebrews struggled with all the way till after the Babylonian exile, they struggled with the fertility religion of praying to the sun and the moon in particular. Okay, so I don't want to get into that too much here, but it's an important thing that fertility cults, praying to the sun under whatever name. And this is a little confusing because depending on which expert you ask, they will disagree. Baal, okay, B-A''A''L. Some pronounce it Baal. That sounds weird in English, so I just say Baal. Baal was some manner of sky god. Some people identify him with the sun. And some identify him with Zeus. I'm more inclined to identify him with the sun because in the book of Jeremiah, the god called Molech and Baal are basically equivalent. They're the same, just under two different names. And the moon, whether she's called Ashtarta or Ashtoreth or Asherah, the moon is the goddess, and she's the feminine principle. So the sun, the masculine active principle, and the moon, the feminine passive principle, humans would worship them by doing all sorts of fertility rituals, and some of them involved really crazy and terrible sexual practices and things, okay? And then at times, even if the country was going through a famine, or if there was a big war that had broken out and they wanted victory, people would even sacrifice their kids to the sun god, to Molech. All right, so it's interesting that here in Genesis, it's very, very careful to just say that the sun and the moon are objects in the sky, and they're put there for a reason. They have utility, but you don't talk to them because they're not living things. All right? So this is utterly different than the religion of the countries around Israel. Completely different. So keep that in mind. Now, it's interesting. If the sun and the moon are there, it actually says that they are there to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness, and that they were, where does it say? Well, that they're there for seasons and such, okay? Now, what does this say about time? What is time? And that's a question that I always ask my students. And conceptually, it's very difficult for a young person to put this together. I don't think I ever really thought about it much. What is time? I'm not asking what time is it, but what is time? And the kids will sit there with this real puzzled look. They're trying to figure out what do we mean by that? What is time? All right. Time is a relationship. It's a relationship. It's the relationship of the earth to the sun. And relationships can change. Okay, so at our distance from the sun, the earth is, of course, is orbiting the sun. And it takes our planet 365 days to go around the sun one time. Now that's 1 year. And in orbiting the sun, the Earth is rotating as well. So you've got, roughly 12 hours of sunlight, 12 hours of relative darkness. Okay. If, however, you could take a trip to Mercury, which you couldn't because you'd be burned to death long before you got there. But if you could take a trip to Mercury and camp out on Mercury, you would find that the planet is orbiting the sun so quickly it only takes 88 days to go around the sun. So one's experience of time on Mercury would be different than the experience on Earth. And I read this somewhere, I may be off a little bit. One of the reasons that Pluto was downgraded so that it's no longer a planet is that 1 year on Pluto is equal to 238 years on Earth. That's how large Pluto's orbit around the sun is. So, since the United States became a country, I guess Pluto has gone around the sun once. Isn't that amazing? All right, so time is relative. It depends on where you are in relationship to the sun. And like I said earlier, relationships can change. And I like to ask this question of my students. Have you ever thought that heaven might be kind of boring? If heaven is being in the presence of God and enjoying Him and worshiping Him, does that sound like something you'd want to do hour after hour, day after day, week after week? Does that sound like fun? And, high school kids, that they're honest, they'll say, no, that doesn't sound fun to me. And that's because what we're doing is we're importing our understanding of time, and we're like taking that with us into heaven. What I'm saying is, don't do that. Because in the book of Revelation, we learn that at the end, after the judgment, and when the new heavens and new earth come into being, that relationship of earth to sun will change. We won't be governed by the sun, the moon. We won't have those seasons and that dependence upon the sun anymore. So what I'm saying is that on the new earth, when it's made perfect and free of sin, we will live in an eternal now. And we won't experience that slow passage of time and that sensation that, man, we've been doing this for how long now? And everybody, we all get bored from time to time here on Earth, don't we? And if you were in a job that was under lockdown or whatever from March until May, you know what I'm talking about. That sensation of, what day of the week is it? I can't even remember. It seems like we just... Okay, and that's a hard way to live, and yet, in the eternal state, that relationship between the earth and the sun will be removed, and we will live in an eternal now, and nothing's going to get old or boring. So if you've ever wondered if heaven would be dull, it won't be, but you got to kind of put that time stuff out of your head. And if you've never thought that heaven would be boring, then you're awesome. You're better than me. All right. So, all right. Day 5, the creation of the fish and the birds. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but if you notice, we're going from the least like God to the most like God. All right, so the sun, the moon, and the stars, they're impressive, but they're not alive. And so in God's hierarchy of things, day 5, when the fish and the birds are created, that's more impressive because they're living things. All right, which takes us to day 6. All right, so I'm going to start reading at verse 24. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Key verses here. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." All right. Now that takes us to the creation of man. Man meaning male and female, not just males. That's not what I mean. Mankind. Okay. Question here. How can there be one God and yet he calls himself us and our? Now I touched on that briefly in the first video. How can God be both singular and plural at the same time? All right, very important question. And here's where we get into kind of a touchy subject with some. As I said at the beginning of the first video, I'm teaching this video from an Orthodox Christian perspective. And by Orthodox, I mean small o Orthodox, not Greek or Russian Orthodox. That's not what I mean. So these are the things that capital O Orthodox people and Roman Catholics and Calvinists and Lutherans and, confessional kind of evangelicals would all agree pretty much. There are some differences. Pretty much on this, and this is the Trinity, okay? And is God a triangle with lines and stuff? No, of course not. He's not a triangle. This is just a conceptual diagram here. I think it's helpful. I think it's very helpful, and I use this with my students, and even my younger students don't have a problem. They can see this. So if you look up at the top there, you've got God the Father, and you see that there's an arrow leading away from God the Father on the right there. And it says, Father is not Son. In other words, God the Father is not identical in person to the Son of God. And then at the bottom you can see the Son of God is not the Holy Spirit. And then if you follow the arrows again, you see that the Holy Spirit is not God the Father. So the Father is distinct in person from the Son, and the Son is distinct in person from the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is distinct in person from God the Father. And yet, you see the other arrows inside the triangle. If you start at the top there, you see that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. Now here's the punchline, okay? This is the part that's really hard, okay? And yet not three gods, but one God. Okay, now that is some high-level stuff, isn't it? Very difficult. And yet not three gods, but one God. That's from the Athanasian Creed, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so I don't mean for this to be, you fling off your headphones and shut off the video and you never watch it again. If you come from a Christian tradition that doesn't like the Trinity word, okay, the word Trinity is not found in the Bible. That's true. It's not. It's just it's a hybrid word. It just means tri-unity. It's a unity of three. Okay, so the word itself, yeah, it's not in the Bible, but the concept is, the concept certainly is. even if you don't think that the concept is, I have found that if you ask, like for instance, Quakers, okay, Quakers don't like the Trinity as a dogma that other Christians have to believe or they're not Christians. Quakers would just say something like, well, sometimes, since there's one God, we sometimes experience him as Father, sometimes we experience him as Son, and sometimes we experience God as Holy Spirit, and God is not divided. There's just one God, and God can reach us in any of those ways that he wants. To me, that's a little loosey-goosey, okay? But I'm not gonna. I grew up in, a Quaker church, and I'm not gonna tell them they're not saved, okay? So, if you don't like that chart, at least you're now aware of it. Okay, there it is. Now, this is another big question, and this one, a lot of debate about this one as well. If God is a spirit, and he is, then how can humans be created in his image? All right, so an image, a picture of something or a physical form. If God is a spirit, how can something be in the image? That's a tough one. And different Christians, again, have disagreed on what this means. Like, for instance, from what I remember, the Eastern Orthodox make a distinction between God's image and his likeness. To me, that never would have occurred to make a distinction between the image or the likeness, but they do. So there's lots of debate over what this exactly means. And remember, I'm teaching junior high and high school students something, and I've thought a lot about this, and I'm kind of stealing this a little bit from C.S. Lewis. He never said it quite like this, but I believe that the easiest way to look at the image of God is to say that God has mind, will, and emotions, and so do we. Okay? God has a mind, God has a will, and God has emotions. Therefore, since we are created in God's image, we also have mind, will, and emotions. All right? I took that three-part thing from C.S. Lewis's Men Without Chests. I think that's the essay I got that from. He didn't use it the same way that I am, but to me that's helpful because we can think about things, we can plan, we can imagine something that doesn't even exist in actuality. I mean, you can imagine something and you don't even see it anywhere on Earth, but it's sort of up there. It's almost like it exists up there, and that's exactly what God did before he made the heavens and the earth. He conceived of things in his mind and then he made them. All right, so we can kind of do that too. We have a willpower. God conceives of the thing, but then he uses energy and imposes his will and makes that thing as an extension. It's outside of himself. Okay, and we have willpower too. And I use the example, if you're a high school football player and your coach, it's in August and you're doing 2-a-day practices and it's miserable, and you're at the evening practice and then they blow the whistle and you think that practice is over. So everybody kind of goes trudging up to the coach, and then he says, all right, I think you're all dogging it, so start running, and I will blow the whistle when we're done. Just start running. If I see anybody dropping out, you won't like what happens to you. Okay, now you start jogging and you don't know how long this is going to take. Could take 12 minutes, could be 15 minutes. It feels like an eternity. So in your mind, you're thinking, man, it's hot out here. I could get heat stroke or something. I really need a drink. I think I'm dehydrated. Man, I feel this pain in my gut. Maybe something's wrong with me. And so you're thinking that something is wrong. And then your emotions are going wild. You're angry, you're frustrated. What part of it, what part of you is it that keeps you going? Well, that's your will. Okay, your will. And in some ways, this is interesting, the will is the part that makes us most like God. I think that kind of a Greek notion of the mind, they would say that that's more like God, the conceiving of and thinking things. I think this is a generalization, but in terms of the Hebrew way of looking at humans, I think the will is the part that we most resemble God in some ways. Okay, so a good will cannot be had without God's help. But if a human has a good will, that makes them an amazing person, even if their mind isn't all that sharp. And I'm sure you've run into people like that before. You go, man, he's, in terms of his school ability or whatever, he's maybe not even that smart, but boy, he's a good person because God's working in his heart, in his will. Okay. And then emotions. Now, to say that God has emotions, that some people don't like that. A lot of the ancient Christian philosophers and theologians didn't like it either, because they would say if God has emotions, then emotions change, and if God is subject to change, then God is imperfect, and if God is imperfect, therefore God is not God. So you can think through some syllogism like that, but the fact is the Old Testament clearly says that God has emotions. The difference is that he's in charge of his own emotions. We aren't. Usually we're not. God is. He has, put it this way, God's emotions are appropriate for the situation because he is perfect. Now, how often are our emotions perfect for the situation? Not always. Here's a little, so mind, will, and emotions, that's how we are in the image of God. And here's a little kind of like slight extra here. God creates, and we've got this little creative flair. Like I said in the first video, we don't technically create things because only God can do that. But we do have this urge to take things that do exist and to recombine them into something else, right? And that creativity that humans have, that's a very peculiar thing. It's an awesome thing. And this is completely speculative on my part. I don't know this. I'm not trying to be disrespectful or anything like that. When you look through the Bible and you look at angels and what angels do, I don't see the same creative aspect among the angels. Angels just do what they're told, which is an awesome thing. And they're super powerful and they're super intelligent and they've been around for a lot longer than we have. But that creativity thing, I'm not certain that angels even have that. And angels are not created in the image of God. The Bible never says that they are. So that's just speculation on my part. I can't prove it, and I'm sure some Real theologians are probably going ballistic if they heard me say that, but it's just something to consider. All right, now we get into the why did God put us here? Well, what are the implications if men have dominion over the rest of creation? What does that word mean? Dominion. It means to rule over and to have the authority to decide what will be done now and in the future. That's dominion. And Americans, we don't use that word much because we don't live in a monarchy. If you lived in England in the 16th century or France in the 17th century, the king and his dominions, or the queen and hers, that means that they had authority over everything in it. Okay, so God, in making man, gave us dominion over the rest of creation. The implications of that, obviously, are huge. If we have dominion over the fish and over the birds and over the livestock, that means that we can eat them. Now, they didn't at first, of course, since there was no death on earth yet, but eventually it's clear that humans have dominion over fish and birds and livestock and such. Okay. Now, this dominion, we still have this. The trick is, do we ever abuse it? And it's pretty clear that we do sometimes. Here's an example. And this goes along kind of with the notion of subduing something. All right, so let me read verse 28 again. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion." Okay, to subdue and have dominion. Subduing something, that's a pretty heavy word there. If it's 1:30 a.m. in a college town on a Friday night, Saturday morning, if the cops get called to a bar because somebody doesn't want to leave, the cops may have to subdue that man, and that subduing is not pretty. So why would God say that humans are to subdue the earth? And this is mysterious. It seems that from the beginning, there's something about the creation that God has made that does have some wild and untamed elements in it. Okay? And those things have to be mastered and then overcome. All right, so how about putting men on the moon? Okay, you probably look it up on YouTube sometime and look at the Saturn V rocket. That's the sort of thing necessary to put a spacecraft and 3 men outside of Earth's gravity and to propel them towards the moon. Something that fierce, that rocket, okay? Gigantic. And so to tell gravity, no, we're leaving, that's a pretty amazing thing, and you have to overcome it. Being from Southern California, there's been lots of earthquakes in my life, and humans building buildings in Southern California, you have a choice. You can build buildings that can withstand an earthquake, or you can go live somewhere else. And so what did humans do? They came up with the math, the physics, and the construction techniques so that buildings don't just fall over. It's amazing. I remember being awakened by an earthquake years ago, and I could see the walls moving, and the light fixture was doing this. And when the earthquake stopped, everything went like that. Not a single picture had fallen off of my wall. The house was fine because the house was designed to do that. All right, so subduing, that's a big part of what humans do. Dominion and subduing. Now, here's where it's open for debate. You ever watched, there's a couple of different cable TV shows about getting gold up in Alaska. These guys rent these, or they buy these gigantic earth mover, claw things that come down and so they're just extracting tons of dirt and then sifting them and rinsing them and doing all that kind of stuff. It totally tears up the landscape, and sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they get enough gold out of all of that to pay for all of the equipment that they've purchased and still have a profit. But then if you were to look at the land after they're done with it, it's a wreck. It's a mess. And it would take centuries for that to recover, if it ever does. So the question is, can you do that? Is that worth it? Is that something God approves of? And the honest answer is, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't like it. Here's another one. How about the splitting of the atom? Look, I am not a pacifist by any means. Okay, I'm not. And that's another question. Sometimes wars have to be fought. But taking the kind of fundamental building block of what a human is, and then inventing a bomb that can separate those bonds that hold our cells together and then vaporize a human, is that a legit use of dominion and of subduing the earth? Lots of people would say yes, and lots of people would say no, that's a genie that should have been left in the bottle. Okay? More could be said about that. At least think about it. Okay? I'll close with this. What you see here in this part of Genesis chapter 1 is the exalted place of human beings in Christianity. We are made in God's image. We're given authority to have dominion over the earth, to fill the earth and subdue it. Okay? And that authority continues. We still have that. Now, because of sin, we abuse those things. But we don't have to abuse them. They can be used in a responsible way. When you compare the place of human beings here in Genesis chapter 1, you compare our exalted place here with the mythologies of the ancient world, there's no comparison. Humans have dignity and worth because we're in the image of God. Compare that to like the Babylonian myth, where humans are just slaves for the gods because the gods are too lazy, they don't want to do anything. Or like the Greek myth of Prometheus and Zeus. Zeus doesn't care about people. And so this notion that every human being has eternal value because we're made in God's image, that's a revolutionary thing. Again, that's not naturally what people believed back in ancient times. It's not naturally what people believe now. So let that be an encouragement to you and a challenge. If you are living your life in such a way that you're not reflecting well the image of God, if you're living in a degraded way, then you got to stop that. Got to stop that. And God will help you. But you got to realize who you are and why you're here first. I've gone exactly 50 minutes. That's a long talk. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. And be thinking of some questions of your own. Perhaps I will answer them. We will continue in Genesis 2 in the next video that we see. Thanks again. See you later. Bye.